Ever feel like your brain's playing a game of telephone with itself? Like you think you're seeing things clearly, but then it turns out there's been some serious whispering down the lane going on.
Yeah, it's like our own minds are playing tricks on us.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today with Albert Mucheiber's book, Your Brain is Playing Tricks on You. We're going to unpack how our brains try to make sense of the world, even if it means, bending the truth a little. Or a lot.
And the funny thing is, we rarely realize it's happening. We just sort of trust our perceptions without question.
Right, like we assume we're seeing things objectively.
But the reality is our brains are constantly filling in gaps, telling themselves stories, shaping our reality in ways we'd never expect.
So it's less about objective reality and more about our brain's interpretation of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so to really illustrate this, picture this. You're scrolling online, and you stumble across that infamous picture, the one with the dress.
Oh, the dress. That's a classic example.
Is it blue and black, white and gold? Everyone had a different take, it seemed like.
And that's precisely what makes it such a perfect illustration. It highlights how much our individual brains influence our perception.
So two people can look at the same exact thing.
And see it completely differently. It all comes down to how our brains process color, light, and context.
It's like our brains are saying, hold on, I need a conclusion here. You can't just have a dress that's maybe two colors.
Exactly. Our brains crave a clear interpretation, so much so that they'll actually invent information if they need to, just to fill in the blanks.
So even when there's room for interpretation, our brain's like, nope, we're picking a lane and sticking to it.
Our brains are wired to reduce uncertainty, even if it means we end up disagreeing with the person standing right next to us.
It's like our brains value a clear conclusion over, well, maybe the actual truth.
And this need for closure, it affects more than just our visual perception. It influences our decisions, our judgments, even our memories.
Okay, so if our brains are so determined to find answers, even when there's wiggle room, where else does it show up?
Well, think about magic tricks.
Oh, interesting.
A good magician is a master manipulator of our perception.
They really play with your mind. It's amazing.
Take, for example, the classic disappearing coin trick.
Right. Such a classic, but it still gets you every time.
And why does it work? Because our brains rely on object permanence.
The idea that objects don't just vanish into thin air.
Right. Things don't just go poof in real life, but the magician makes it seem like they do.
And that's where the trick lies.
And so our brains, they scramble for an explanation.
Where did it go? How do they do that?
Exactly. Did it disappear? Did he really just make it vanish? We're wired to seek a cause and effect.
It's like our brains need a story to make sense of things, even when that story is, well, a magic trick.
Exactly. We crave that narrative.
So even when we know we're being tricked, our brains still try to make sense of it.
Our brains are constantly trying to fit things into our existing understanding of the world.
And sometimes that means filling in the blanks with, well, magic.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
But this drive for coherence, it can have even more profound implications.
Oh.
Mucheiber talks about Anton's syndrome. Have you heard of it?
Vaguely. It rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
It's a rare condition where people are blind, but they're completely unaware of their blindness.
Wait, really?
They'll bump into things, but then they'll invent explanations for why they bumped into them. They'll claim to see things that aren't there.
That's incredible.
Their brains are essentially constructing a reality where they can see, even though it contradicts their actual sensory input.
So even in the face of, well, blindness, their brains are still clinging to that story.
It's a fascinating, albeit extreme, example of just how powerful our brains' drive for narrative coherence can be.
So even when reality and perception clash, our brains sometimes choose perception.
In a way, yes.
Wow. That's kind of unsettling, but also, I guess, a testament to how adaptable our brains are.
Definitely. And while most of us won't experience anything as dramatic as Anton syndrome,
Right, thankfully.
it highlights a fundamental truth. We all have an inner storyteller in our minds.
And that inner storyteller is always hard at work.
Weaving narratives, trying to make sense of our experiences. Sometimes those stories are accurate, and sometimes, well, they're not.
So we're walking around with these master storytellers in our heads, shaping our realities without us even realizing it.
Pretty much.
It's both kind of cool and kind of creepy, don't you think?
It certainly makes you think twice about what you believe you're seeing, doesn't it?
It really does. And on that note, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back to dive even deeper into the tricky world of our brains. It's like our brains have this internal script, and they're constantly trying to make everything fit into it.
And what's even wilder is that these narratives, they aren't always solo projects, you know?
Oh, what do you mean?
Our experiences, the people we interact with, it can all influence these stories in some pretty surprising ways.
That makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
we're constantly being bombarded with information and opinions.
Exactly. And it all seeps into our subconscious, shaping those narratives without us even realizing it.
So it's like our brains are these collaborative storytellers, influenced by both our internal biases and our external experiences.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, this is making me think about how easily we can be swayed by, like, advertising or even just, a persuasive friend.
Absolutely. But let's stick with the brain science for a moment. Kerber talks about this really interesting researcher, Elizabeth Loftus. She did this groundbreaking work on false memories.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of her. It's something about how our memories aren't as reliable as we think, right?
Exactly. Loftus's research showed just how malleable our memories can be. One of her most famous experiments involved showing participants a video of a car accident.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So they were probably trying to see, like, how accurately people could remember details, right?
Right, but they added a twist. Afterward, they asked some participants how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other.
Smashed. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
And they asked other participants how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Just one word difference.
And that one word changes how people remember the entire event. Seriously.
You got it. The people who heard the word smashed consistently reported higher speeds. And get this, they were even more likely to remember broken glass, even though there wasn't any in the video.
No way. Just from hearing that one word, that's kind of scary. It's like our brains are filling in the blanks with whatever fits the narrative, even if it didn't actually happen.
Exactly. And it gets to the heart of something called the misinformation effect. Our memories aren't perfect recordings. They're being reconstructed and sometimes even altered by the information we encounter after an event.
Wow. This is making me think about that term, gaslighting. Isn't that when someone manipulates another person into doubting their own memories and perceptions?
Yes. And it's a perfect example of how this malleability of memory can be exploited in really harmful ways. With gaslighting, the abuser might deny events, contradict the victim's memories, even plant false information.
Just to make the victim question their own sanity. It's awful. It's like they're taking advantage of the fact that our brains are already, like you said, filling in the blanks, making up parts of the story.
Unfortunately, yes. Our memories are more vulnerable to suggestion than we might realize. And it's not just external manipulation we have to watch out for.
Oh, there's more. I'm kind of afraid to ask.
Well, have you ever heard of choice blindness? It's another fascinating quirk of our brain's storytelling abilities.
Choice blindness. It rings a bell. It's something to do with, like, not realizing the choices we make.
More like not realizing when those choices are subtly changed on us. One study involved asking people to choose which of two faces they found more attractive.
Okay, so like a pretty standard experiment so far.
Right, but here's the catch. Through a clever sleight of hand, the researcher would actually switch the photos before revealing the chosen face.
Hold on, so they'd think they were justifying a choice they didn't even make.
Exactly. And the crazy part is, most people didn't even notice the switch. They'd go on to explain why they preferred the face they were now looking at, even though it wasn't the one they initially chose.
Oh, you're kidding. That's like our brains are choosing for us, and then they're like, oh, yeah, that was totally your decision.
It's amazing, isn't it? It all circles back to this deep-seated need for consistency. Even when our choices are manipulated, we find ways to justify them, even if it means, well, distorting our perceptions.
That's both fascinating and a little terrifying. Like, how much control do we actually have over our choices if our brains are capable of this kind of trickery?
It's a question worth pondering. And it makes you wonder about all those choices we make every day, you know? Are we really choosing based on our own preferences, or are we being subtly influenced in ways we don't even realize? Like, when you're at the grocery store, for instance, are you really picking that cereal because you like it or because of some clever marketing ploy?
Okay, now I'm feeling very seen and not in a good way. So our brains are, making up stories, filling in blanks, even like rewriting our memories and preferences just to fit this narrative they've created.
Yeah.
It's kind of a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom, you know?
Oh, good, because I was starting to get a little worried there.
Mookheiber does offer some strategies for, like, navigating this tricky brain terrain.
Okay, good. I could use a map and compass right about now.
He dives into this idea of heuristics and biases, which are basically these mental shortcuts our brains use. They help us make quick decisions, but they can also lead us astray sometimes.
So, like, our brains are trying to be efficient, but sometimes they cut corners a little too sharply.
Exactly. Think about like representativeness bias.
Representativeness bias. Remind me what that one is again?
Basically, it's when we judge the likelihood of something based on how well it matches our existing stereotypes.
Oh, right, right. Like if I see someone reading a book and wearing glasses, I might assume they're a librarian.
Exactly, even though there are plenty of people who read and wear glasses who aren't librarians.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Our brains like to categorize. What other biases should we watch out for?
Well, there's confirmation bias, which is a big one.
Confirmation bias? What's that one again?
It's our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Oh, yeah. And we tend to ignore anything that challenges our belief.
Exactly. It's like we're selectively choosing evidence to support what we already believe.
We're all guilty of that sometimes.
Absolutely. We're all susceptible to it. And then there's anecdotal evidence bias, which is when we give too much weight to personal stories or isolated incidents.
Oh, so like when your friend tells you their grandpa smoked cigarettes his whole life and lived to be 100, so cigarettes can't be that bad for you.
Exactly. We find stories really compelling, but they don't always reflect the bigger picture. Just because one person had a certain experience doesn't mean it's true for everyone.
So it's not that our brains are, like, intentionally trying to mislead us. It's just that these mental shortcuts are kind of built into the system.
Right. They're a natural part of how our brains process information. The key is being aware of them. Knowing they exist helps us catch ourselves when we might be falling prey to them.
So how do we do that? How do we, like, outsmart our own brains?
Well, it starts with cultivating a healthy dose of self-awareness, you know? Question your assumptions. Be open to different perspectives. Don't be afraid to admit you're wrong sometimes.
Easier said than done, right? Especially when it comes to things we care about deeply.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to another really important concept. Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, right.
Yeah.
Fill us in.
It's that uncomfortable feeling we get when our actions and beliefs are in conflict. Mukaber uses that fable of the fox and the grapes. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah. The fox that couldn't reach the grapes.
Exactly. He wants those grapes so badly. But when he can't reach them, he convinces himself that they were sour anyway.
The classic case of sour grapes. We do that all the time, don't we? We justify our behaviors or beliefs to avoid feeling bad about ourselves.
It's a way to protect our egos, right? It's easier to change our perceptions than it is to admit we were wrong.
And speaking of changing our perceptions, Mukaber also talks about this idea of the illusion of knowledge. What's that all about?
So the illusion of knowledge is basically this tendency to overestimate how much we actually know, especially in areas where we may actually be, well, a little clueless.
Oh, I know some people like that.
Yeah.
It's like the less they know, the more certain they are that they're right.
It's a dangerous combination. Mukaber gives this example, a bank robber who smeared lemon juice on his face thinking it would make him invisible to security cameras.
Lemon juice? Seriously?
Seriously. He was so confident in his knowledge that he didn't even bother to test it out first.
Oh, no. I guess that's the illusion of knowledge in action. So we've got all these biases, mental shortcuts, illusions. It's like our brains are almost working against us. What are we supposed to do with all of this?
Well, like we were saying, awareness is key. The more we understand about how our brains work, the better equipped we are to make more informed decisions, to navigate this complex world.
And maybe to have a little more compassion for ourselves and others along the way, right? Because we all make these cognitive blunders sometimes.
Absolutely. We're all just doing our best with these wonderfully complex and sometimes baffling brains of ours.
Well said. This has been quite the deep dive, wouldn't you say?
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground today.
To our listeners, if you want to learn more about the fascinating and sometimes frustrating ways our brains work, I highly recommend checking out Your Brain is Playing Tricks on You by Albert Mukaber.
It's a great read.
It just might change the way you see the world and yourself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains curious, everyone.